The 12 Judges of Israel. Origins. The promise divided. The dust of conquest is settling. Joshua stands at the border of the Promised Land, his weathered hand still gripping the sword that has carried Israel through 40 years of wilderness and 7 years of war. The walls of Jericho have long since crumbled into memory. The kings of Canaan lie beneath the earth. And now comes the hardest battle of all, the one fought not against enemies, but within the very people God has chosen. For 3 centuries before this moment, Israel was a unified nation under judges. But you must understand, these judges were not local administrators. They were not elected officials with jurisdictions over a single tribe. These were the Shephatim, the deliverers, the liberators, the men and women whom God raised up to rescue Israel from oppression, to marshal them against enemies, and to lead them back to covenant. Deborah, Gideon, Samson, Jephthah. These were not bureaucrats. They were warriors. They were prophets. They were raised up by the Spirit of God in moments of crisis, and when their work was done, they faded back into tribal life. But now, in the moment when Joshua draws his final breath and passes the mantle to his successors, something shifts. The conquest is complete, the land is divided, and Israel faces a question it has never truly faced before. How do we govern ourselves in peace? The answer arrives not as divine revelation, but as necessity. And in that necessity, something old dies and something new, something far more complicated, is born. This is the story of how 12 men became the first true administrators of Israel. How a people chosen to be ruled by God alone learned to govern through human hands. And how in that transition, the seeds of tragedy were quietly planted. The conquest and the divide. To understand why the 12 judges became necessary, you must first understand what Joshua inherited when he took command of Israel after Moses died. He inherited essentially a problem with a solution already embedded within it. At Sinai, God had organized Israel around a specific sacred structure. 12 tribes, one for each of the sons of Jacob, each bearing their ancestor's name and carrying their own history, their own territory, and yes, their own pride. This wasn't Moses being sentimental. This was architecture. Tribal identity was the foundational unit of Israelite society. When you sacrificed, you brought your offering as a member of a tribe. When you gathered for feast or war, you gathered by tribe. Your inheritance was tribal. Your justice was administered by tribal elders. Tribe was not a social accident. It was the skeleton upon which Israel's entire body was built. But Joshua faced a problem unique in human history. He had to divide the land of Canaan among 12 tribes who had never actually possessed land before. For 40 years they had wandered. The generation that left Egypt, except for Joshua and Caleb, never set foot in Canaan. The generation that conquered it was a generation born in the wilderness, shaped by wandering, trained by necessity. And now they had to transition from being a nomadic, unified military force into 12 separate agrarian communities. The distribution was complicated. Some tribes received territory that was easy to defend, fertile and compact. Judah received the hill country of the south. Benjamin received a small territory near Jerusalem. But others, like Dan, received land that was contested, difficult to hold, isolated. Some tribes split their territory. The half-tribe of Manasseh stretched across the Jordan. The Levites received no contiguous land at all. Instead, they were scattered among the other tribes, assigned to specific cities, sustained by tithes and offerings. In those early days after the conquest, the tribes were still bound together by the raw memory of their unified struggle. The enemy was visible: Canaanite populations that hadn't been fully destroyed, Egyptian garrisons in some regions, Philistine traders and warriors beginning their encroachment from the coast. But beneath the surface, something was happening that Joshua could not stop. No matter how brilliant a military commander he was, the tribes were becoming separate peoples. When Joshua died, we're told in the book of Judges, the Israelites inquired of God, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites?" And God answered, "Judah shall go up." But notice what happens next. The text tells us that Judah asked Simeon to join them, but it does not tell us that Israel mobilized as a unified force. Each tribe fought its own battles. Judah drove out the people of the mountains, but could not drive out those in the valleys because they had chariots. Benjamin drove some people out, but did not dispossess them. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites, but allowed them to live among them. Naphtali did not. Asher did not. Zebulun did not. The pattern is clear. The conquest was not a unified, complete military campaign under a central authority. It was 12 separate, ongoing conflicts with varying degrees of success and commitment. And with each passing decade, the gap between the tribes widened. Some tribes were thriving. Others were struggling. Some were intermarrying with the remaining Canaanite population. Others were maintaining stricter separation. And crucially, some were becoming geographically isolated from their brothers in ways that made coordinated action increasingly difficult. This was the world into which the first judges emerged, not as administrators, but as deliverers. When Othniel arose to deliver Israel from the oppression of Cushan-Rishathaim, he was not the judge of Judah or the judge of Benjamin. He was the judge raised up by God for all Israel. And the text tells us that in that moment, unified against their enemy, Israel knew peace for 40 years. The pattern of crisis and deliverance. The system of the judges, as it emerged in the first centuries after Joshua's death, was profoundly responsive to crisis. It was not a governmental structure designed in advance. It was more like scar tissue forming over a wound, a reactive formation shaped by necessity. The pattern became monotonously familiar. Israel would turn away from God. They would adopt the worship of Baal and Asherah, the gods of the peoples around them. God would allow them to fall under oppression. A foreign people would dominate one region or another, sometimes the whole land, though never completely. In their distress, Israel would cry out, and God would raise up a judge, a person filled with the Spirit of God, who would deliver them from their enemies. These judges were not administrators, they were liberators. Ehud, a left-handed man from Benjamin, assassinated the Moabite king Eglon and freed Israel from 18 years of oppression. Shamgar, son of Anath, killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Deborah, a prophetess, summoned Barak to lead Israel against the Canaanite general Sisera, and together they routed an army whose iron chariots should have been unstoppable. Each of these figures, and the list goes on. Gideon, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, arose in response to a specific crisis. Each demonstrated God's power in a particular way, and when the crisis was over, they faded. Some judged Israel for a season, some faded away, some were replaced by their sons, who led Israel for a time. until they too declined into apostasy and another crisis came. This was working after a fashion. It kept Israel alive. It maintained, however tenuously, their identity as God's people. But it was not a system that could scale. It was not a system that could govern in times of peace. And perhaps most importantly, it was not a system that could survive the ambitions of individual leaders or the desires of the people themselves. By the time the period of the Judges was entering its later centuries, tensions were mounting. Some judges were successful military leaders, but poor spiritual guides. Some were raising sons who had no claim to their father's authority, but expected to inherit their father's position. And the people, increasingly prosperous and landlocked, increasingly civilized and settled, began to look at the nations around them and wonder, why do they have kings and we do not? The 12 tribes had become 12 separate entities, united in loose federation, bound together by a common ancestry, a common law, a common covenant. But they were beginning to need something more than crisis-born deliverance. They were beginning to need stable, continuous governance. And they were beginning to look for it in the form of something Israel's law explicitly forbade: a king. But that is the story of Samuel and Saul. Before that, there was one more transition. Before Israel could have a king, she needed to develop the apparatus of governance that a king would rule. And that apparatus was the 12 judges, or more accurately, the 12 governors, the 12 administrators, the 12 men who, in the chaotic later centuries of the Judges, became something more than military deliverers. They became the first administrators of Israel. The transition begins from deliverer to administrator. The Hebrew Bible preserves a curious list in Numbers 1, 4-15. After the people of Israel are numbered in the wilderness, we're told that each tribe was assigned a leader. The text gives us their names: Nahshon, son of Amminadab, for Judah; Nethanel, son of Zuah, for Issachar; Eliab, son of Helon, for Zebulun; Elishama, son of Ammihud, for Ephraim; Gamaliel, son of Pedazur, for Manasseh; Abidan, son of Gideoni, for Benjamin; Ahiezer, son of Ammishaddai, for Dan; Pagiel, son of Ochran, for Asher; Enahob, son of Renan, for Gad; Ahira, son of Enan, for Naphtali; and for Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, special arrangements. These were the Nesiim, the princes, the leaders, the representatives of each tribe. In the wilderness, they had specific duties. They led their tribes on the march. They made offerings at the dedication of the tabernacle. They represented their peoples before Moses and before God. But they were not judges in the sense that Deborah or Gideon were judges. They were administrators of the daily life of their tribe. The question that gradually emerged over the centuries of the Judges period was this: could these two roles merge? Could you have a man who was both a judge, someone who administered justice and maintained law, and a Nasi, a prince who managed the daily affairs and governance of his tribe? The evidence suggests that this merger happened, though not all at once, and not without significant tensions. In the book of Judges, we occasionally get glimpses of this transition. When Gideon is offered the kingship by the people, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson," he refuses. But his 70 sons and the women he had married are mentioned not as an aside, but as a sign of his power, his authority, his following. He is not simply a military commander. He is becoming a dynastic leader. Later, when Abimelech, Gideon's son, actually does attempt to make himself king over Shechem, It is not viewed as entirely revolutionary. It's portrayed as wrong, as a perversion of the proper order, but not as completely unprecedented. Abimelech is able to gather supporters. He is able to establish himself in power. He even has a court and officials and a palace. The story ends tragically with his death at the siege of Thebez, but the very fact that he could attempt kingship suggests that the structure for it was already beginning to take shape. And this was the paradox. As the tribes became more settled, more prosperous, more organized, the charismatic judges, the ones raised up directly by God in moments of crisis, became less frequent. The stories of Gideon's victories and Samson's strength were centuries old. The people lived in a different world now. They had stable borders, more or less. They had agriculture. They had cities. They had prosperity. And in that prosperity, they needed structures of governance that responded to daily needs, not occasional crises. So slowly, almost without anyone quite planning it, the 12 tribal leaders began to evolve from being mere representatives of their people into being something more substantial. Judges, administrators, governors. The 12 governors. Order from chaos. The clearest picture we have of what the 12 judges eventually became appears in the books of Samuel and Kings, in the historical accounts of David's and Solomon's reigns. By then, the judges were fully transformed into governors, administrators of districts, collectors of taxes, organizers of labor, dispensers of justice. Under Solomon, we're told, Israel was divided into 12 administrative districts. Each had a governor, a nasi or administrator, who was responsible for providing provisions for the king's household for 1 month out of the year. The list names 12 men. Ben-Hur in the hill country of Ephraim, Ben-Dekar in Makaz and Shalbim and Beth-Shemesh and Elon-Beth-Hanan, Ben-Hesed in Aruboth, Ben-Abinadab in Naphoth-Dor, Baana son of Ahilud in Tanach and Megiddo, Ben-Geber in Ramoth-Gilead, Ahinadab son of Iddo in Mahanaim, Ahimaaz in Naphtali, Baana son of Hushai in Asher and Bealoth, Jehoshaphat son of Paruah in Issachar, Shimei son of Elah in Benjamin, Geber son of Uri in the land of Gilead. These are the 12 judges fully evolved into administrative function. They are not war leaders. They are not raising up armies to fight against enemies. They are collecting taxes. They are organizing the supply of the king's court. They are serving as judges in local disputes. They are the interface between the central government and the tribal peoples. And notice something crucial. The territories they govern don't always correspond to the original tribal boundaries. Solomon reorganized Israel's administration by region rather than by tribe. This was controversial. It meant weakening tribal identity in favor of regional administration. It meant centralizing power in a way that the original 12-tribe system had not allowed. But it was also necessary. As Israel became more complex, more unified, more urban, the old tribal structures proved inadequate. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The transformation from the charismatic judges of the period of settlement to the bureaucratic governors of Solomon's reign happened gradually, over centuries. And the crucial transitional period, the one where we can actually see the transformation happening, is in those later centuries of the Judges, the ones recorded in the book of Judges itself. The dark years. When the Judges began to fail, the book of Judges is dark. This is not a book that believes in progress. It is a book that believes in decline. The opening chapter recount the stories of the great judges, Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon. These are stories of deliverance, of faithfulness rewarded, of God's power manifest in the land. But as the book progresses, something changes. The judges become less reliable. The periods of peace grow shorter. The periods of oppression grow longer and darker. And crucially, the judges themselves become more morally ambiguous. Jephthah is introduced as a mighty warrior, but he is also a man born to a prostitute, cast out by his own tribe, dwelling in the land of Tob, an outsider by birth and circumstance. He is brought back only when his people are desperate, and his leadership is marked by rash vows, by the terrible sacrifice of his own daughter, by violence against his own tribal brothers in Ephraim. When he dies, the text tells us, he is buried in Mizpah, a quiet death for a troubled man. Samson is born under a Nazirite vow, dedicated to God from conception, forbidden to cut his hair, forbidden to eat unclean things, marked as holy. But he spends his life in pursuit of Philistine women, in violation of the law that forbade Israelites to marry foreigners. He is strong, absurdly, miraculously strong, but he is also self-serving, driven by lust, reckless, violent, and ultimately, he is captured, blinded, and killed in a final act of suicide against the Philistines. The Samson story is not a story of triumph. It is a story of wasted potential, of a man marked for greatness who squanders his calling on personal vendetta. And between these stories, the text begins to offer commentary. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. This phrase appears multiple times in the book of Judges, like a refrain, a diagnosis. It is not a celebration of freedom. It is a lament. It is saying, without a central authority, without a king, people do what seems right to them. And what seems right to each person is different, and the result is chaos. The book culminates in two stories that are almost unbearably dark. In the story of the concubine of Gibeah, a Levite's concubine is gang-raped to death by the men of the city of Gibeah in the tribe of Benjamin. The Levite demands justice. The tribe of Benjamin refuses to surrender the men responsible. The result is a civil war, the near-total destruction of the tribe of Benjamin, and an atrocity in which the other tribes massacre the women and children of Shiloh to provide wives for the survivors of Benjamin. In the other dark story, the story of Micah and the migration of Dan, we see the idolatry and religious chaos that had infected Israel. Micah, a man from the hill country of Ephraim, sets up a household shrine with an ephod and teraphim, household idols, and employs a young Levite as his private priest. Later, 600 armed Danites, migrating north in search of territory, come upon Micah's house, steal his idols, and take his priest with them, convincing him to serve their new settlement rather than Micah's household. It is a bizarre, almost surreal story, but what it illustrates is the religious fragmentation and chaos of the period. By the end of the book of Judges, Israel is not moving toward unified kingship because the judges have been succeeded by better administrators. Israel is descending into chaos precisely because there is no authority capable of maintaining order, no structure capable of administering justice consistently, no central force capable of enforcing the covenant. It is in this context, not of triumph, but of decline, that we can understand why the 12 judges evolved into something more formal, more administrative, more governmental. The role of the Levites and the priesthood. To understand the origins of the 12 judges fully, you must understand the role of the Levites. The Levites were not judges in the tribal sense. They were not administrators of secular governance. They were priests, teachers, and judges in a specifically religious and legal sense. When Moses organized Israel, the Levites were set apart. They were given no territory, no inheritance in the land. Instead, they were given 48 cities scattered throughout the other tribes' territories, and they were supported by the tithes and offerings of the other Israelites. Their role was specifically religious. They maintained the tabernacle, they performed sacrifices, they taught the law, and they administered justice according to that law. In Deuteronomy, we have an entire law code devoted to the role of judges and officials. Judges and officials shall you appoint in all your towns, which the Lord your God is giving you, tribe by tribe, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. The law prescribes that these judges and officials shall enforce the law, settle disputes, and maintain order. But here's the crucial point. In the theoretical structure of Israel's governance, the judges and officials were supposed to operate under the supervision of the central priesthood. Difficult cases were to be brought to the priests, to the judges who served at the central sanctuary. The local judges, the judges in the towns and cities, were supposed to be applying law that was defined and maintained by the priesthood, with the high priest as the ultimate authority on questions of law and covenant. This created a system with inherent tensions. On the one hand, you needed local governance. Disputes had to be settled locally. Justice had to be administered in a timely way. You couldn't bring every case to the central sanctuary. On the other hand, you needed consistency. You needed to ensure that justice was administered in accordance with the covenant, not according to the whims of local strongmen. The solution was the development of a two-tiered system: local judges and officials in the cities and towns, answerable to the Levitical priesthood, which maintained the central sanctuary and the central law. But this system only worked if the central priesthood maintained its authority, and if the local judges actually respected that authority. As Israel settled and prospered, and as the tribes became increasingly separate, both of these conditions began to weaken. Local judges became more independent. Tribal leaders accumulated power, and the priesthood, centered at Shiloh after Joshua's time, was not always strong enough to maintain the discipline that the system required. One of the most significant events in the period of the judges was the destruction of Shiloh. At some point, the text doesn't give us a precise date, but it appears to be sometime in the 11th century BCE, possibly in connection with a Philistine invasion. The city of Shiloh was destroyed, the tabernacle was lost, and the priesthood's authority was shattered. The Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines, though it was eventually recovered. The central sanctuary was destroyed, and Israel's governmental and religious system was left without its central anchor. It was in the aftermath of this crisis that the need for a more robust administrative structure became clear. With the priesthood scattered and the central sanctuary destroyed, who would maintain order? Who would administer justice? Who would hold the 12 tribes together? The answer, as we enter the period of Samuel and the monarchy, begins to be the king, assisted by appointed officials and judges who operate under his authority. But we're not quite there yet. First, there had to be transitional figures, men who had the authority to maintain some semblance of order in an increasingly chaotic situation. And these men were the later judges, figures like Samson and Jephthah, and the series of judges whose names are listed in the later chapters of Judges, many of whom we know almost nothing about. The lesser judges, the administrative phase. The book of Judges mentions 6 major judges: Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson, whose stories are told in detail. But it also mentions 6 minor judges, or lesser judges: Tola, Jair, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and Shamgar, whose stories are barely told at all. These lesser judges are mentioned in a strikingly different format. After Abimelech, Tola, son of Puah, a man of Issachar who had saved Israel, rose to judge Israel. He judged Israel 23 years, then died and was buried in Ophrah. After him came Jair, a Gileadite, who judged Israel 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys, and they had 30 cities in the land of Gilead that are called Havoth Jair to this day. After him, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. He had 30 sons and 30 daughters. He sent his daughters outside and brought in 30 young women for his sons. He judged Israel for 7 years. Notice the pattern. These judges are identified not primarily by their military victories, but by their administrative tenure. He judged Israel for X years. They are credited with having large families, with possessing multiple cities and territories, with having offspring who inherit or succeed them. Jair is particularly interesting. He had 30 sons, and they rode on 30 donkeys, and they possessed 30 cities. This is not the description of a military deliverer. This is the description of an administrator, a man of wealth and status, whose sons inherit their positions of prominence. The phrase, "they rode on 30 donkeys," is particularly telling. It suggests a sort of provincial nobility, men who traveled through their territories, administering justice and collecting taxes. Similarly, Ibzan of Bethlehem had 30 sons and 30 daughters, and he arranged marriages between them and young people from other places. This is not a military hero. This is a man building dynastic alliances, expanding his influence through marriage and kinship networks, the way administrators and kings do. The lesser judges represent a transitional phase. They are presented as judges. They maintain the title and presumably maintain the legal and spiritual authority associated with it, but they are functioning increasingly as administrators. They are establishing quasi-dynasties. They are accumulating territorial holdings. They are becoming something more like the governors that would later serve under Solomon. The text doesn't emphasize their military exploits because there were fewer major military exploits to record. The crises that had called forth the great deliverers of earlier generations were becoming less frequent. The Philistine threat, which would eventually consume Samson and drive Israel toward monarchy, was still emerging, still taking shape. The Canaanite populations, though never fully eradicated, were being increasingly absorbed into Israelite society or pushed to the margins. So what was happening in this transitional period? Israel was, in many ways, settling into a more normal pattern of existence. Tribes governed their own territories. Judges administered justice and collected taxes. The priesthood maintained the law and the religious life of the people. And the whole system was held together by the memory of common conquest, common covenant, and common ancestry. This was not the system that God had originally commanded, but it was the system that Israel could maintain without constant military crisis. It was a system adapted to peace rather to perpetual warfare, but it was not a stable system. The second instability was the theological and political tension between the authority of the judges and the authority of the priesthood. In theory, the judges and the priesthood were supposed to work in concert, but in practice, they often competed for authority. Some judges, like Samson, were Nazirites, marking them as especially holy. Some judges, like Ehud, had a special relationship with God that seemed to give them spiritual authority. And some judges, particularly in the later period, seemed to be purely secular administrators with no particular spiritual claim. The priesthood, centered at Shiloh and later at other sanctuaries, maintained the law of God and the religious practices of Israel. But the priesthood's authority was based on ritual and theological knowledge, not on military power or administrative capability. So there was often a tension between the judge who could actually enforce order and the priest who was supposed to be the guardian of the law. The third instability was the problem of succession and dynastic ambition. The great judges like Deborah and Gideon didn't have direct successors, or if they did, those successors weren't typically granted the same authority. But the minor judges, Jair, Ibzan, and others, were increasingly establishing quasi-dynasties, with their sons inheriting their positions. This created a different kind of instability. What happened when a judge's son was not as capable as his father? What happened when a judge's son was ambitious, but lacked the spiritual authority that the judge himself had claimed? The instability of the 12. Why the judges could not last. To understand why the system of the 12 judges ultimately failed, why Israel eventually demanded a king, you have to understand the inherent instabilities in the system. The first instability was tribal pride and tribal separatism. The 12 tribes had never been truly equal in power or population. Judah and Ephraim were large, powerful tribes. Benjamin was located in a strategically important position, but Dan was small and isolated. Simeon was small and subject to Judah. Zebulun and Issachar were in the north and often cut off from the rest of Israel by geography and enemies. The half-tribe of Manasseh was split by the Jordan River. This inequality meant that when decisions had to be made for all Israel, they were fraught with tension. How much weight should the larger tribes carry? Should judges be chosen equally from each tribe, or should power be proportional to population? Who had the authority to speak for all Israel when the tribes couldn't agree? Abimelech's attempt at kingship illustrates this problem in its starkest form. He was the son of Gideon, but he had no claim to the spiritual authority his father had exercised. So he established his kingship through violence and coercion, gathering supporters in Shechem and using them to murder his brothers and seize power. The fact that he could do this at all suggests that the old basis for authority, personal charisma and divine calling, was already breaking down. But his story also shows the dangers of replacing that with mere coercive power. The fourth instability was the increasing frequency of internal conflict. The period of the judges began with conflict against external enemies, Moabites, Canaanites, Philistines. But as the period progressed, an increasing amount of the violence recorded in the text is internal. Tribes fighting tribes. The tribe of Benjamin nearly destroyed by the other tribes. The Levite and his concubine gang raped to death and the resulting civil war. The Danites stealing idols and violently seizing territory. This internal violence was a sign that the unifying external threat was decreasing. The Canaanites were no longer a serious threat to Israel's existence, and that the internal mechanisms for maintaining unity and order were weakening. When external enemies keep you unified, you don't notice as much the weaknesses in your internal structure. But when those external enemies are gone, those weaknesses become acute. The fifth instability was religious corruption and syncretism. From the earliest days of settlement, the Israelites were confronted with the gods of Canaan, Baal, Asherah, and the entire pantheon of Canaanite religion. These gods were associated with fertility, prosperity, and the agricultural cycle. The Israelites were transitioning from a nomadic, pastoral people to an agricultural people, and the temptation to adopt or blend Canaanite religious practices was constant. The text of Judges returns again and again to this theme. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshipped the Baals and the Ashtaroth. This wasn't mere political rhetoric or religious propaganda. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Israelites were actually adopting or partially adopting Canaanite religious practices. The worship of Baal and Asherah was becoming normalized in many communities. This religious syncretism undermined the entire basis of the covenant. If Israel was supposed to be the people of God, bound by a law given at Sinai, bound to worship God alone, bound to maintain holiness and separation from the surrounding peoples, then the increasing adoption of Canaanite religious practices was a fundamental corruption of Israel's identity. And this corruption made it harder for the judges to exercise authority. A judge who was supposed to be enforcing God's law, but whose own people were increasingly worshipping other gods, faced a crisis of legitimacy. He could use force to compel obedience, but force couldn't change hearts. And without genuine religious commitment from the people, the whole system of judges and law was ultimately hollow. The sixth and final instability was the sheer complexity of governing a settled, agricultural, increasingly urbanized people. The judges had been raised up to lead in crisis, to marshal armies, to fight enemies, to deliver people from oppression. But the skills required to fight a war are not the same as the skills required to administer justice in a time of peace, to collect taxes, to organize public works, to maintain infrastructure, to settle complex property disputes. Gideon, the great military deliverer, was presumably not an expert in property law. Samson, with his strength and his exploits, was not necessarily equipped to judge disputes about land inheritance or commercial transactions. The system that worked for crisis-based leadership was not equipped to handle the ongoing administrative needs of a settled society. The call for a king. By the time of Samuel the prophet, sometime in the 11th century BCE, the pressure had become unbearable. The Philistines had been expanding their power and influence along the coastal regions and into the interior. The priestly center at Shiloh had been destroyed. The Ark of the Covenant had been captured and lost. Israel was fractured and demoralized. And the people said to Samuel, "Appoint for us a king to govern us like all the nations." This request has often been interpreted as a rejection of God, and certainly Samuel and the text present it that way. The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." But it's important to understand what the people were actually asking for. They were not asking for something entirely new. They were asking for a more permanent, more centralized, more stable version of what the judges had already become. They wanted a hereditary ruler, a king, someone who would consolidate the authority of the judges, enforce the law consistently across all the tribes, maintain a standing army, and provide the stable governance that the looser system of judges could no longer provide. They were asking, in other words, for what the lesser judges had already begun to establish, but on a grander scale and with a clearer institutional structure. Samuel reluctantly anoints Saul. Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, a significant choice, as Benjamin is centrally located and strategically important. Saul is described as a man of great physical stature and beauty, and he has a connection to the spiritual realm through a band of prophets. When the Spirit of God comes upon him, he prophesies. He is, in other words, positioned as a bridge between the old system of charismatic, spirit-filled leadership and the new system of centralized, institutionalized kingship. But the transition doesn't happen smoothly. Saul's kingship is constantly contested. He is in conflict with Samuel, who represents the old priestly and prophetic authority. He is in conflict with David, a rival who is also anointed king. He is in conflict with the Philistines, who remain the primary external threat. And Saul, despite his physical strength and his initial divine favor, is psychologically tormented, prone to jealousy and rage, ultimately tragic. The system of the 12 judges didn't end with Saul. It evolved. David, when he comes to power, maintains the judges and officers of his realm, but they now serve under his authority as king. Solomon explicitly divides the kingdom into 12 administrative districts, each with its own governor, each responsible for supplying the king's court. But in that evolution, something was lost. The direct, immediate connection between a leader and God, the connection that characterized the great judges, was replaced by a more institutional, more distant, more purely political form of authority. The judges had been deliverers, people called by God in moments of crisis. Kings were heirs, chosen by God but also by human ambition and dynastic succession. And this shift, from the judges to the kings, from crisis-based leadership to permanent governance, from tribal independence to centralized authority, would shape everything that came after. The theological meaning of the shift. To truly understand the origins of the 12 judges and why they evolved into something else, you have to understand the theological crisis that this evolution represented. In the covenant at Sinai, God had made an extraordinary claim. God would be Israel's king. The Lord is our judge. The Lord is our lawgiver. The Lord is our king. It is He who will save us. This was not merely religious sentiment. It was a radical political claim. Israel was supposed to be a nation whose fundamental law came not from any human ruler, but directly from God. The judges, in the original conception, were supposed to represent this direct divine rule. They were called by God. They were filled with God's Spirit. They delivered Israel according to God's will. Yes, they were human, and they had human limitations and failures. But their authority was supposed to ultimately derive from God, not from any secular power. But as the judges evolved into administrators and then into governors under the king, this direct connection weakened. Authority became increasingly mediated through human institutions. Laws came to be seen as the product of the king's wisdom, not direct revelation. Justice was administered by officials who were appointed by the king, not called by God. This was not evil, necessarily. It was simply human. Every human society needs institutions, and institutions are necessarily human structures. But it represented a loss of something that Israel had been called to embody, the reality of God's direct rule over God's people. The prophets would spend the next several centuries wrestling with this theological problem. They would call Israel back to the covenant, back to the law of God, back to the recognition that even the king was subject to God's word. And the great prophets, Samuel, Nathan, Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, would constantly be in tension with the kings of Israel and Judah, reminding them and the people that human rule was not ultimate, that God's law transcended any king's authority. The system of the 12 judges represented in some ways a more authentic embodiment of the covenant ideal, but it was also ultimately unsustainable. You cannot govern a complex society based purely on the charisma of individual leaders or the moment-by-moment direction of the divine spirit. You need structures, institutions, laws that persist beyond the life of any individual leader. So the shift from judges to kings was both inevitable and tragic. It was necessary, but it also represented a loss. And the Bible, with its remarkable theological honesty, records both the necessity and the loss. It celebrates the judges as deliverers, as examples of God's power at work in history. But it also records the chaos and corruption that made kingship seem like a necessity. And it records, without flinching, the injustices and failures that kingship would bring. The 12 in the eternal design. But there is one final layer to this story. Though the system of the judges, in its practical, historical form, gave way to the system of kings, the number 12 and the concept of the 12 judges would never fully disappear from Israel's consciousness. In the mythology and theology of Israel, the 12 tribes were not simply an administrative convenience. They were a cosmic reality. There were 12 tribes because Jacob had 12 sons, and this was seen as reflecting something fundamental about God's design for humanity and the world. The 12 tribes would be restored and renewed. The 12 tribes would be the basis of the final eschatological kingdom of God. When Jesus began his ministry, he chose 12 apostles, 12 men who would be the foundation of the new covenant community that would eventually transcend Israel's ethnic and tribal boundaries. And he said to them, "Truly I say to you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man shall sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." The idea of the 12 judges, the 12 representing all of God's people, administering justice, maintaining covenant, would resurface again and again in Israel's hope for the future. It was not simply a past reality. It was an eschatological vision, a picture of what God ultimately intended for Israel and the world. This is not to say that the historical 12 judges of ancient Israel were directly connected to the theological concept of the eschatological 12, but it is to say that the Bible sees a continuity. The judges were not merely a historical accident or a pragmatic response to crisis. They were understood as part of God's design for how God's people would be governed and led. So when we study the origins of the 12 judges, how they evolved from crisis-based deliverers into administrators, from a loose tribal confederation into a more organized system of governance, we are not studying something merely historical and antiquarian. We are studying how God worked through the institutions and structures of human history, shaping them toward purposes that transcended their immediate political reality. Closing reflection. The story of the 12 judges of Israel is not a story about progress. The Bible does not present the evolution from judges to kings as an improvement, as movement toward a better system. In fact, if anything, the Bible is nostalgic for the age of the judges, especially the early period when judges were called by God in moments of crisis and delivered Israel through extraordinary displays of divine power. But neither is it a story about decline in the sense of simple regression. What happened during the period of the judges was real development. Israel went from being a confederation of tribes held together by a common military experience to being a more complex, more settled, more organized society. The judges evolved from being military deliverers to being administrators and judges in the legal and governmental sense. This evolution was driven by necessity. As the external threat from the Canaanites and other peoples diminished, as the tribes became more settled and more prosperous, as the population grew and the challenges of governance became more complex, a simpler system of crisis-based leadership was no longer sufficient. But this same evolution created new challenges and new tensions. It opened the door to ambition, to corruption, to the misuse of power. It created the possibility of kings, and kings, as the book of Samuel will go on to show, could be as destructive as they were necessary. The 12 judges represent in many ways a middle path, more organized than the purely tribal confederacy that preceded them, but less centralized and less subject to individual megalomaniacal ambition than the monarchy that would follow. They represent Israel at a moment of transition, trying to maintain the reality of God's covenant while adapting to the demands of human civilization. That tension between the covenant ideal and the practical reality of human governance would run through all of Israel's history. It would be the source of the great prophetic tradition that would eventually produce some of humanity's greatest moral and spiritual achievements. And it would be the source of Israel's tragic failures and corruptions, the ways that political power would compromise and distort the original vision. But it all begins here, in the period of the Judges, when Israel first had to answer the question, how do we govern ourselves as God's people? The answer they worked out in the system of the 12 judges was neither perfect nor permanent, but it was real, and it shaped everything that came after. From the dusty roads of ancient Canaan to the theological vision of a restored and renewed Israel, the 12 judges remain a testimony to the truth that God works through human history, through human institutions, through the struggle of imperfect people trying to live out an impossible calling. And in that struggle, in that very real, very human, very messy working out of what it means to be God's people in the world, in that is the heart of the biblical story.